Mid-November 1873, down in the southeastern corner of Montana Territory, Sarah Brennan found herself facing a limestone cliff with nothing more than a pickaxe she'd borrowed, 47 silver dollars, and just 6 weeks before the winter storms would hit. That morning, her husband's people had made themselves perfectly clear. A wife who couldn't give them children after 3 years didn't deserve a spot near the warmth of their fire. The closest town lay 89 miles to the south. The air had already gotten cold, dropping down to 34 degrees. Every person homesteading within 20 miles knew what the old hands always said. If you didn't get 4 walls up and enough firewood stacked by December, you wouldn't make it to see spring. She wasn't the first woman the Alesa family had thrown out. She wouldn't be the last one either, but she'd be the only one who walked right up to that canyon edge, studied that south-facing rock wall with its natural overhang, and decided salvation didn't need timber when God had already done the hard work of carving out the foundation. The sandstone formation rose 63 feet above Rosebud Creek, its layers telling stories older than any homestead claim. Sarah had spotted it 3 months back while she was hauling water, a deep alcove, protected from those north winds, already dry inside. Now she stood in front of it with one simple calculation running through her head. A cave didn't need a mortgage. Lumber didn't grow on credit, and winter respected shelter no matter what people called it. William Crawford found her there on day 3, hauling rocks from the creek bed in a grain sack she'd stitched together from flour bags. He'd served as a Union engineer during the war, built fortifications from Virginia clear through to Tennessee, and now he ran 240 acres of wheat near the creek's bend. He pulled his horse up short, taking in what he was seeing. This Polish woman with dirt caked under her nails, stacking limestone chunks in some pattern only she seemed to understand. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, taking off his hat with that practiced courtesy that couldn't quite hide how confused he was. "Are you building a chimney?" "A home," she said, not even looking up from her work. Her English carried those thick consonants from Krakow, each word chosen carefully. "Stone holds heat better than pine does. Stays cool when it's hot, warm when it's cold, and it won't burn." Crawford got down from his horse, walked over to where she'd already dug 2 feet into the alcove's floor. The woman had herself a system going: pile up the dirt she'd excavated to one side, use the bigger rocks for a retaining wall, save the smaller ones for filler. She'd been at this maybe 72 hours and had already created a level platform extending 6 feet into that natural shelter. "You're planning to winter in a cave?" He didn't say it mean, but the doubt ran as deep as any well shaft. Sarah straightened up, wiped her hands on an apron that had definitely seen better days. "Mr. Crawford, you build with what God provides. He provided this." She gestured toward the overhang. 16 feet deep already, faces south so the winter sun reaches inside. The rock is soft enough to carve but hard enough to last, and it didn't cost me anything except sweat. Crawford studied that formation with an engineer's eye. She wasn't wrong about how it faced. That alcove would catch every bit of winter sunlight available. The overhang kept it protected from rain and snow. The creek sat just 200 yards down the slope for water. But winter in Montana Territory wasn't about geography. It was about survival measured in cordwood and calories. And this woman had neither one. "Ma'am, with all respect, I've built structures in 7 states and 3 territories. Stone walls without mortar won't hold heat. You'll freeze to death by January, and we'll find you come the spring thaw." He said it gentle, the way a man delivers bad news to someone who hasn't quite accepted reality yet. "My wife and we've got room in the barn. It's not much, but it's warmer than... I worked 2 seasons in the Chicago stockyards. Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying no anger, just that flat certainty of someone who'd already run the numbers. 14-hour days in the cold rooms where they hung the beef. Stone walls 3 feet thick. Inside, it stayed 42 degrees all winter, even when the air outside dropped to 0. The men who built those rooms, they were Irish. They learned it from their fathers who learned it back in the old country. Thermal mass, they called it. The thick stone absorbs heat during the day, releases it at night. Stays warmer than wood, burns less fuel. She picked up the pickaxe again, turning back to her excavation. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Crawford, but I'll be fine." He rode off, shaking his head, convinced he'd be helping dig her grave before Christmas arrived. That night over dinner with his wife Elizabeth, he told her about the encounter. She listened, her expression hard to read, then said something that stuck with him. "The woman's been thrown away like spoiled meat. Maybe she figures dying on her own terms beats dying on someone else's charity." By the end of November, Sarah had carved 8 feet deeper into that limestone, creating a space roughly 24 feet deep and 12 feet wide. The natural ceiling rose 11 feet at the entrance, sloping down to 7 feet at the back. She'd built a retaining wall at the front using those larger stones she'd excavated, fitted so tight you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. No mortar, just that ancient technique of weight and friction, each stone chosen for how it locked with its neighbors. Victoria Sterling came by on November 28th with her daughter Clara, supposedly to bring a loaf of bread, but really to see what this scandalous cave woman was building. Victoria's husband ran the largest homestead in the valley, 180 acres of prime bottomland, a proper 2-story house with glass windows and enough cattle to weather any winter. She'd been born in Connecticut, educated at a girls' academy, and had very specific ideas about how civilized people lived. "Sarah," she said, using the first name with that kind of forced familiarity that signals disapproval. "This is madness. A woman alone in a hole in the ground. What will people say?" Sarah was mixing clay from the creek bed with dried grass, creating plaster for the interior walls. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. This wasn't her first time working with primitive materials. "They'll say I froze to death, or they'll say I survived. Either way, I'll know I tried." Clara, 13 years old and curious in that way daughters have before propriety beats it out of them, walked to the back of the cave, running her hand along the smooth limestone. "It's not cold in here," she said, surprised. "I thought caves were supposed to be cold." "The earth stays 54 degrees year-round at this depth," Sarah explained, grateful for genuine curiosity instead of judgment. "In winter, that's warmer than the air outside. In summer, cooler. The stone moderates it further. Soaks up heat when it's available, releases it when it's not. Like a bank, but for warmth instead of money." Victoria wasn't convinced. "And when the real cold comes? When it's 20 below zero and the wind is howling down this canyon?" "That stone won't burn, Mrs. Brennan. You'll have no heat, no way to cook, nothing." Sarah pointed to the corner where she'd been building something that looked like a beehive made of clay and stone. "Masonry heater," she said. "Russian design. My grandmother had one back in the old country. You build a small hot fire in the morning, maybe burns for 2 hours, but the smoke travels through these internal channels." She traced the pattern in the air, heating all this mass of clay and stone. Then it radiates warmth for 18, sometimes 24 hours. Uses 1/3 the wood of an open fireplace. Gives steady heat instead of spikes. "You expect us to believe you're building a Russian stove from memory?" Victoria's tone had shifted from concern to something sharper. "This is fantasy, Mrs. Brennan. Dangerous fantasy." "I watched my grandmother build 2 of them," Sarah said evenly. "I was 12 years old, supposed to be learning embroidery with my sisters. Instead, I mixed clay and handed her bricks. She said a woman who can build her own warmth never has to beg for it." Victoria left in a huff, taking her bread with her. Clara looked back twice, fascinated despite her mother's obvious disapproval. December arrived with 11 inches of snow and temperatures that dropped to 8 degrees at night. Sarah had completed the masonry heater, spending 3 weeks getting those internal channels right, testing them with small fires, adjusting when the draft didn't pull correctly. She'd also built a wooden door frame at the cave entrance and hung a thick buffalo hide she'd traded for, leaving her coin purse $12 lighter. The hide could be rolled up during the day for light and air, dropped at night for insulation. Father Michael Nowak arrived on December 9th, the Polish priest who rode a circuit covering 180 miles of scattered Catholic settlers. He'd heard about Sarah from the other families, and his conscience wouldn't let him ignore a woman of his flock living in what everyone described as degrading conditions. He found her outside the cave, working on what appeared to be a series of low stone walls arranged in a stepped pattern below the entrance. Drainage channels lined them with rocks, created a system to divert snowmelt away from her dwelling. It showed forethought he hadn't expected. "Sarah Brennan," he called out in Polish, falling back on their shared language. "This is no way for a Christian woman to live," she responded in English, her point clear without being said. This was America now, and she wouldn't retreat into the old country's tongue just because it was more comfortable. "Father, I attend Mass when you're in the valley. I pray every night. I work hard, hurt no one, and keep my own counsel. What about this offends God? Living like an animal in a hole in the ground." "Is that what Noah did?" she interrupted, her voice sharp. "Noah built an ark that everyone called foolish until the rain came. Abraham lived in tents, Father. Moses in the desert. Jesus himself was born in a cave in Bethlehem." "Yes, a cave. Not a stable like the pretty paintings show. The Church of the Nativity in the Holy Land, it's built over a cave. I read that in a book once." Nowak paused, caught off guard by scripture wielded as defense. Those were different circumstances, were they? Sarah set down her shovel. "Father, I have no husband to provide for me, no family that wants me, no money for land or lumber. But I have hands that work, a mind that remembers, and rock that doesn't care whether I'm worthy of it. When the blizzards come, this cave won't care that I'm barren. It'll just keep me alive." The priest looked at the dwelling, really looked at it for the first time. The stone walls were plumb and solid. The masonry heater, which he'd dismissed as fantasy, showed precise craftsmanship. The woman had excavated and built what amounted to a 288-square-foot home in 5 weeks with hand tools. She'd oriented it to catch maximum sunlight, created drainage, even built a small alcove near the entrance that he realized would function as cold storage. "How did you learn to build like this?" he asked, his tone softening. "My father was a stonemason in Krakow. Built churches, bridges, houses for the wealthy. He wanted sons to carry on the trade, but got 4 daughters instead. I was the youngest, the one always underfoot at his work sites. He'd explain things just to keep me busy, never thinking I'd remember. When he died and we had nothing, I remembered." She smiled, but it carried no warmth. "Then I married a man who promised America would be different. He was right. Here they throw you out more efficiently. Father Nowak left troubled, promising to pray for her, which Sarah accepted with the weary grace of someone who knew prayers didn't stop winter. By December 20th, word had spread through the valley. The Brennan woman wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. 3 different families had ridden by on various pretexts, wanting to see the cave house for themselves. What they found challenged everything they thought they knew about frontier construction. The interior walls were plastered smooth with clay mixed with dried grass and a small amount of lime she'd made by burning limestone chips. The floor was hard-packed earth covered with woven grass mats. The masonry heater dominated one corner, its mass reaching nearly to the ceiling, and the whole space smelled faintly of wood smoke and earth. Not unpleasant, but fundamentally different from the pine and sweat smell of a timber cabin. Most striking was the temperature. Outside, the December air hovered around 19 degrees. Inside the cave, with just the morning fire long since burned out, it registered 58 degrees, according to the mercury thermometer hanging near the door. Sarah had invested 4 of her precious dollars in that thermometer, understanding that proof mattered more than claims. Samuel Hayes, a former railroad surveyor who'd homesteaded 160 acres of scrubland, couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew. He'd built 3 different houses in 2 territories, survived winters in Nebraska that killed cattle where they stood, and he'd never seen a dwelling maintain temperature like this with so little fuel input. "How much wood are you burning daily?" he asked, doing calculations in his head. "One fire in the morning, burns about 2 hours," Sarah answered. "Maybe 3 if it's below 0 outside. I use dead cottonwood from the creek bottom. 1 cord should last me all winter at this rate." Hayes's eyes widened. His own cabin, well built by any standard, consumed nearly a cord every 2 weeks just to keep the temperature tolerable. "That's impossible. The heat loss alone." "There is no heat loss," she explained, gesturing to the thick walls. "In your cabin, Mr. Hayes, heat escapes through every gap in the logs, every crack around the windows, straight up through the roof. You're heating the outdoors as much as the indoors, constantly fighting the cold. Here, the stone absorbed the heat when I first started firing the heater 3 weeks ago. It's been releasing it slowly ever since. Every fire adds a little more to the mass, but the mass itself is the real heater. The stone doesn't lose heat to the outside because it's surrounded by earth, which insulates it naturally." "You're describing a battery," Hayes said slowly, the engineer in him recognizing the principle. "A thermal battery. I'm describing how people survived winters in Europe for 1,000 years before they had coal or oil," Sarah corrected. "My grandmother could heat her entire house, 6 rooms with 1 masonry stove and 2 fires a day. Rich people did it with fancy tile stoves that looked like furniture. Poor people did it with clay and stone. But the principle was the same. Store the heat, release it slowly, use less fuel. Right now, if you're finding value in how our ancestors solved problems without modern technology, I'd invite you to subscribe to this channel. We're documenting techniques that survived centuries of use, knowledge that's being forgotten as we rush toward convenience. These stories aren't just history. They're a library of solutions that still work today. Hit that subscribe button. December 23rd brought Nathan Rivers, and with him something Sarah hadn't expected: respect. Rivers was Shoshone, though he'd been raised in a mission school and now worked as a guide and translator for settlers. He'd lived in both worlds long enough to recognize competence wherever he found it. He didn't knock or call out, just appeared at the cave entrance at midday when the winter sun illuminated the interior, and studied the construction with an expert's eye. "Earth Lodge," he finally said. "Different materials, same concept. My mother's people, the Mandan, they built these along the Missouri River. Entire villages of them, 60 feet across, housed extended families through winters that made this look mild." Sarah, who'd been working on storage shelves carved directly into the limestone, turned to face him. "I didn't know that. Most whites don't," Nathan said, no judgment in his tone. "They see the Sioux in their buffalo hide teepees and think all Indians lived in tents. The Mandan, the Hidatsa, the Arikara, they built permanent earth lodges with timber frames and soil-covered roofs. Stayed 70 degrees inside when it was 30 below outside. Lasted for generations." He walked to the masonry heater, running his hand over its surface. "This is smart. More efficient than an open fire. My grandmother would approve." They talked for an hour, trading knowledge like valuable currency. Nathan described how Earth Lodge builders would char the timber frames with controlled fire to prevent rot, how they calculated the smoke hole size to create proper draft without losing heat. Sarah explained the internal channels of the masonry heater, how Russian peasants had refined the design over centuries of brutal winters. "The settlers who laugh at you," Nathan said as he prepared to leave, "they're proving why their grandparents survived in Europe for 10,000 years, while their great-grandchildren will struggle here." They forgot that survival isn't about pride. It's about what works. Christmas Eve arrived with a temperature of -2 degrees and winds that scoured the canyon walls. Sarah attended midnight mass in the small church 11 miles south, riding a mule she'd bought with the last of her coins. Father Nowak's sermon focused on finding God in unexpected places, and whether he looked at her when he said it, she couldn't tell. She returned home before dawn to find her cave dwelling exactly as she'd left it. Door secure, interior temperature at 56 degrees. The masonry heater's thermal mass radiating gentle warmth that would last until she built the next fire. Outside, the wind shrieked with a sound like nails on slate. Inside, silence and warmth prevailed. New Year's Day, 1874, brought William Crawford back to her door with an apology and a proposition. The winter had proven harder than expected. His timber cabin, despite double walls and a good foundation, struggled to maintain temperature above 45 degrees without burning through fuel at an unsustainable rate. Several families in the valley faced similar problems, and he'd watched Sarah's cave dwelling with increasing interest. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, hat in hand despite the cold. "I was wrong about the cave, about thermal mass, about all of it. And I'm not too proud to admit when a woman knows more than I do." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Would you be willing to consult on a project? There's 5 families up in Wolf Creek Canyon. They settled late season, got their cabins built, but didn't think through the heating. They're burning furniture to stay warm. I'm thinking if we modified their structures with some of your techniques, added thermal mass somehow, we might save them." Sarah considered this. Every instinct told her to refuse. These were the same people who'd watched her husband's family cast her out and done nothing. But Nathan's words echoed in her mind. Survival isn't about pride. "I'll help," she said, "but I'm not a consultant. I'm a builder, and I work for pay. Either cash or trade goods, your choice." They shook hands, and Sarah Brennan became the first woman builder in southeastern Montana Territory, though no newspaper would record it, and no history book would note it. January brought the real winter. Temperatures plunged to -20 degrees and stayed there for 6 days straight. The Wolf Creek families, following Sarah's guidance, had built interior masonry heaters using river stone and clay, smaller versions of her design, but effective nonetheless. Their fuel consumption dropped by 2/3. Their interior temperatures stabilized, and word spread faster than prairie fire. By late January, Sarah had consulted on 11 different homesteads, teaching the same principles her father had taught her, that her grandmother had lived by, that builders across cold climates had proven for centuries. Thermal mass beats insulation. Radiant heat beats convection, and working with natural materials beats fighting against them. She charged modest fees, some in cash, some in trade goods. One memorable payment in the form of a milk cow that would prove invaluable. Her coin purse, nearly empty in November, now held $73. More importantly, she'd built something her husband's family could never take away: a reputation. February 14th changed everything. The blizzard came from the northwest with the kind of intensity that old-timers measure by body counts. Temperatures dropped to -38 degrees. Wind speeds exceeded 60 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Snow fell at 3 inches per hour, drifting to heights of 12, 15, 18 feet against any obstacle. The Sterling family, Victoria, her husband Robert, Clara, and 2 younger children, were caught 5 miles from home returning from a trip to the trading post. Their wagon horse broke through creek ice, panicked, and threw Robert hard enough to crack 3 ribs and possibly his collarbone. Victoria managed to free the animal and get Robert back in the wagon, but the blizzard was intensifying by the minute. They couldn't see the trail. The temperature was dropping fast, and Robert was coughing blood. Clara, who'd never forgotten her visit to the cave, who'd secretly sketched its design in her school notebook, remembered Sarah's dwelling sat less than 2 miles northeast of where they were now. If they could find Rosebud Creek and follow it upstream, they almost didn't make it. Twice the wagon became mired in drifts. Once Victoria had to physically drag the horse forward, while Clara pushed from behind, and the younger children huddled with their semi-conscious father. But Clara's memory proved accurate, and the limestone cliff face loomed out of the snow like salvation carved in stone. Sarah heard the pounding on her door over the wind's howl and pulled the buffalo hide aside to find 5 people in various states of hypothermia and 1 man clearly injured. She didn't hesitate, didn't question, didn't remind Victoria of their last conversation, just pulled them inside, barred the door against the wind, and went to work. The cave dwelling, built for 1, now housed 6. But its design proved more resilient than anyone had predicted. The 288-square-foot space felt crowded, but not impossibly so. The masonry heater, which Sarah fired immediately with a larger load of wood than usual, radiated enough warmth to begin thawing frozen clothing within 20 minutes. She examined Robert first. 3 broken ribs confirmed by feel, possible collarbone fracture, and the coughed blood suggested either a punctured lung or severe bruising. Without a doctor, without medicine, without anything but knowledge and improvisation, she did what frontier women had done for centuries. She made do. Willow bark tea for the pain and inflammation, boiled in water from her stored supply. Careful binding of the ribs with strips of cloth torn from her own spare clothing, tight enough to stabilize, loose enough to allow breathing. A bed made from her sleeping furs and all available blankets, positioned near the heater where the warmth concentrated. And then the hardest part, waiting to see if the lung injury would worsen or heal. The blizzard raged for 63 hours. Outside, the temperature reached -41 degrees. Wind chills probably hit -70 or worse. The kind of cold that kills in minutes, that turns breath to ice crystals before it leaves your lungs. Inside the cave, The temperature never dropped below 62 degrees. Victoria Sterling, who'd called this dwelling madness, who'd predicted Sarah would freeze to death, spent those 63 hours watching the thermometer, watching the masonry heater that Sarah fired twice daily, watching the stone walls that never sweated with condensation, never radiated cold, never failed to protect them. On the second day, when Robert's condition had stabilized enough to allow conversation, she finally spoke. "I owe you an apology. More than one, probably." Sarah, who was crushing dried herbs for a poultice, didn't look up. "You owe me nothing, Mrs. Sterling. This is what people do. They help each other survive. At least, it's what they're supposed to do." The words hung in the air, their weight unmistakable. Victoria had the grace to accept them in silence. Clara spent the blizzard asking questions. How deep should thermal mass be? What ratio of clay to grass made the best plaster? Why did the smoke from the masonry heater smell cleaner than a regular fireplace? Sarah answered each one, recognizing in this girl something of her younger self. The one who'd rather learn about joinery than embroidery, who'd watched her father work with the intensity of a scholar studying sacred texts. The younger Sterling children, 7-year-old Henry and 5-year-old Lucy, were less interested in construction and more interested in the novelty of living in a cave. They explored every corner, discovered the cold storage alcove where Sarah kept food insulated by the earth's constant temperature, marveled at the grass mats she'd woven, and generally found the whole experience a grand adventure that would fuel storytelling for years. On the third day, the wind finally died. The snow stopped. The temperature climbed to a merely brutal -1 degree. Sarah opened the door to find the world transformed. Drifts higher than her head, the creek frozen solid, the landscape alien and white and absolutely silent. William Crawford arrived 6 hours later on horseback, leading a rescue party of 8 men who'd been searching for the Sterling family since the storm began. They found them safe, warm, and very much alive inside a dwelling that most of the searchers had dismissed as a fool's errand just 2 months earlier. Crawford stood in the cave's entrance, taking in the scene. The injured man resting comfortably, the children playing, the women talking quietly, and the thermometer reading 64 degrees while the world outside remained frozen and hostile. He turned to the others, men he'd known for years, experienced frontiersmen who'd survived Nebraska winters and Wyoming blizzards, and said, "Gentlemen, I believe we've been building our houses wrong." Word of the blizzard rescue spread through the valley like ink through water. Within a week, Sarah had 17 requests for consultation. Within a month, she'd taught 4 different families how to construct masonry heaters. By March, 3 homesteaders were excavating hillsides to create earth-sheltered structures modeled after her design. And here's what you need to understand about frontier innovation. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't driven by pioneer spirit or rugged individualism. It was driven by the cold, hard mathematics of survival. Sarah's cave dwelling used 70% less fuel than a standard timber cabin, while maintaining higher interior temperatures. That wasn't just efficiency. It was the difference between making it through winter and burning your furniture, then your floorboards, then dying when those ran out. The homesteaders who adopted her techniques did so because they worked. The ones who didn't, well, some of them didn't make it to spring. That's the reality frontier myths prefer to gloss over. Natural selection happened fast out there, and it didn't care about your pride or your prejudices. Father Nowak returned in March to find Sarah teaching a class. Yes, an actual class, to 11 people in front of her cave dwelling. She'd built a small demonstration masonry heater showing the internal channels, the firebox design, the heat riser that created draft. She was explaining in clear English the principles of thermal mass and radiant heat that she'd learned as a child, that had saved her life, that were now saving others. He apologized for doubting her, which she accepted with the same practical grace she applied to everything else. Then he asked a question that would shape the rest of her life. Would you be willing to teach this at other settlements? I cover 180 miles on my circuit. I know at least 5 communities that could benefit. Sarah considered the offer. She'd built a life here, modest but stable, profitable even. She'd proven herself to the people who doubted her. She could settle into comfortable obscurity, maintain her cave dwelling, continue her consultations, and live out her days in peace. But then she thought about the Sterling children shivering in that blizzard, about families she'd never met who might face the same situation, about knowledge that could die with her or spread to help others survive. I'll do it, she said, but I need something in return. Name it, Nowak said. Recognition that this knowledge didn't come from me. It came from my grandmother, my father, from Russian peasants and Polish masons and Mandan builders, and every person who figured out how to survive cold without modern convenience. I'm just the messenger. The wisdom is old. For those of you who've stayed with us this long, who value this kind of practical knowledge over flashy innovation, I want to ask you to join our mission. Subscribe to this channel. Not because we're entertaining, but because we're preserving. Every story we tell, every technique we document, every forgotten solution we bring to light. These are pieces of human knowledge that took centuries to develop and can disappear in a generation. Help us keep this wisdom alive. Hit that subscribe button. Sarah Brennan spent the next 4 years traveling Father Nowak's circuit, teaching communities across Montana Territory how to build efficiently, how to work with natural materials, how to apply Old World knowledge to New World challenges. She charged fair prices, lived simply, and saved enough to eventually buy 40 acres of land along Rosebud Creek. Paid in full, owned outright. Her name on the deed. She never remarried. When asked why, she'd smile and say that independence, once earned, wasn't easily surrendered. She built a proper house on her land, but it incorporated a masonry heater, earth berming, and thick stone walls that stored and released heat with the efficiency she'd learned to trust. The cave dwelling itself, she maintained it, kept it weatherproof, and eventually donated it to the Catholic mission school as a teaching site. Father Nowak used it for years to demonstrate practical building techniques to students, most of whom arrived from Europe with knowledge their families had accumulated over generations, but no idea how to apply it in this new landscape. Some of those students went on to build earth-sheltered homes across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. A few even published guides, though they rarely credited a Polish woman as their teacher, preferring to cite European traditions or Native American techniques. Sarah didn't seem to mind. The knowledge spreading mattered more than who got credit. Clara Sterling became one of Sarah's most dedicated students, learning not just building techniques, but the underlying principles of thermodynamics, material science, and practical physics. She eventually attended normal school in Helena, became a teacher herself, and spent 32 years educating children about applied science. In her classroom hung a detailed cross-section drawing of a masonry heater with a plaque reading, "Designed by Sarah Brennan, who proved that wisdom has no gender." Victoria Sterling, to her credit, underwent a transformation that survivors of near-death experiences often report. She became one of Sarah's most vocal advocates, using her social position to legitimize what had previously been dismissed as eccentricity. When the territorial legislature considered building codes in 1879, Victoria testified about the blizzard, about the cave dwelling that saved her family, about the efficiency that could save others. The codes that eventually passed incorporated requirements for thermal mass in public buildings. A small victory, but a real one. William Crawford built 3 more houses in his lifetime, each incorporating lessons from Sarah. He calculated that the masonry heater in his 1876 farmhouse reduced his annual fuel costs by 68% compared to his original cabin. He published those numbers in the territorial newspaper with a note reading, "Credit where due." Mrs. S. Brennan of Rosebud Creek taught me that engineering pride is expensive. Nature's engineering is free. Nathan Rivers continued his work as a guide, but added a sideline connecting settlers with Native American building techniques. He collaborated with Sarah on several projects, creating hybrid designs that combined European masonry with Earth Lodge principles. These structures proved remarkably effective. One built in 1877 still stands today, maintained by the Montana Historical Society as an example of cross-cultural innovation. The cave dwelling itself was used as emergency shelter at least 7 more times before the 1890s brought railroads, telegraph lines, and the infrastructure that made such refuges less critical. But it remained a teaching site, a physical demonstration that survival often depends on reconsidering assumptions. Here's what the modern archaeological record tells us. Between 1870 and 1900, at least 43 earth-sheltered or earth-integrated dwellings were built in southeastern Montana Territory. Most have collapsed or been deliberately removed, but foundations remain. 3 are still partially intact. And thermal imaging done in 2019 on the Crawford farmhouse, the one built in 1876 with Sarah's masonry heater, showed that even 143 years later, thermal mass continues to moderate interior temperatures, requiring 54% less heating energy than comparable structures of the same era. The academic papers examining frontier housing efficiency rarely mention Sarah Brennan by name. They discuss vernacular architecture and immigrant building traditions and thermal mass applications in pre-modern construction. They cite European precedents and Native American influences. But dig into the footnotes, check the regional records, and you'll find her. Teaching, building, proving that survival wisdom transcends culture, gender, and prejudice. She died in 1911 at age 63, wealthy by frontier standards, respected by those who'd known her, and largely forgotten by history until researchers started asking questions about those unusually efficient homesteads scattered across Montana Territory. Her obituary in the Miles City newspaper ran 3 sentences and misspelled her last name. It mentioned that she'd been a builder and teacher, but gave no details. The cave dwelling was sealed in 1923 when the mission school closed, partially reopened in 1967 by archaeology students from the University of Montana, and finally restored and stabilized in 2003 as part of a Frontier Heritage Project. You can visit it today if you know where to look, though most tourists prefer the prettier, less practical sites that fit their image of Western expansion. Inside, if you stand in the center where Sarah once fired her masonry heater, you can feel the temperature difference. The stone walls still moderate the climate, still demonstrate the principles she taught. In winter, it's warmer than the outside air. In summer, cooler. The Earth's constant 54-degree baseline, combined with thermal mass that hasn't forgotten its purpose, continues doing exactly what she understood it would do. This is what separates survival knowledge from survival myth. The myth tells you about rugged individuals conquering the wilderness through sheer grit. The knowledge tells you about a Polish woman with a pickaxe and a memory who understood that her grandmother's wisdom about heating a cottage in Krakow would translate perfectly to heating a cave in Montana. The myth celebrates innovation as if it's magic. The knowledge acknowledges that most innovation is just old solutions applied to new problems. Sarah Brennan didn't invent thermal mass. She didn't discover that stone holds heat better than wood. She didn't create the masonry heater or the earth lodge or the principles of passive solar design. She simply remembered what others had forgotten, applied it when others said it wouldn't work, and proved through survival, the most honest form of proof, that wisdom persists across continents and centuries because it's true. The families she saved, the students she taught, the builders who learned from her work. They spread that knowledge across the frontier in ways that shaped homesteads from Montana to Wyoming to the Dakotas. Most never knew where the techniques originated. They just knew they worked, which was good enough. The blizzard of February 1874 killed 19 people in southeastern Montana Territory. 5 of those deaths occurred within 30 miles of Sarah's cave dwelling. Families who might have survived if they'd been closer, if they'd known about that refuge carved into the limestone, if they'd had access to the shelter she'd built with nothing but borrowed tools and remembered wisdom. Victoria Sterling never forgot that her prejudice nearly killed her family. For the rest of her life, whenever someone dismissed an idea because of who proposed it, rather than whether it worked, she'd tell the story of the cave. Sometimes people listened. More often they needed to learn the lesson firsthand, the way she had, through a close brush with consequences. That's the nature of wisdom. It's invisible until the crisis proves it necessary. The families who adopted Sarah's techniques before winter didn't do so because they believed. They did so because they'd calculated fuel costs and survival odds and decided that pride was expensive. The ones who waited until disaster forced their hand learned the same lessons more painfully. If this story resonated with you, if you value learning from history rather than repeating its mistakes, I'll ask one more favor. Give this video a like. Not for us, but for the algorithm that might show it to someone who needs it. Every person who learns that survival wisdom transcends prejudice. That practical knowledge matters more than social standing. That the old ways often worked better than we admit. That's one more person who might remember when it counts. Sarah's story isn't exceptional because she was special. It's exceptional because it's typical of knowledge that exists in every culture, every generation, every family that's had to survive difficult circumstances with limited resources. The woman who figured out how to keep her family fed through a drought. The man who improvised a water system when the well ran dry. The community that shared resources when individual hoarding would have killed them all. These stories don't make it into history books because they're not dramatic enough, not centralized enough, not attributable to great men doing great deeds. They're just people solving problems using knowledge accumulated over generations, applied with creativity and desperation, and whatever materials were at hand. The cave dwelling stands as a monument to that kind of knowledge. Not purpose-built, not planned in advance, but created by someone who understood that survival depends on what you know more than what you own. Sarah Brennan walked away from her husband's family with $47 and a lifetime of watching her father work stone. One of those resources depleted quickly. The other sustained her for decades and helped save lives she'd never meet. That's the real legacy of frontier wisdom. It compounds. Every person who learns a technique can teach others. Every successful application proves the concept. Every crisis survived adds evidence that some knowledge is too valuable to forget. So the next time you hear someone dismiss an idea because it's old or foreign, or proposed by someone without credentials. Remember a Polish woman standing in front of a limestone cliff with nothing but a pickaxe and a memory. Remember that the earth doesn't care about your assumptions. The cold doesn't respect your prejudices. And survival favors those who remember what works, regardless of where it came from. Sarah Brennan built her home inside a cave because she had no other choice. But in doing so, she demonstrated that limitations can become advantages, that ancient wisdom often surpasses modern arrogance, and that the best innovations are usually just old solutions applied with new understanding. The blizzard came, the cave endured, and everyone inside lived to tell the story, which is the only metric that matters when winter has you in its teeth and pride is a luxury you can't afford. That's the lesson carved in limestone, proven by survival, and preserved in a stone dwelling that still moderates temperature 150 years later. Still teaching anyone willing to learn that our ancestors weren't primitive, they were practical. And practical knowledge, it turns out, never goes out of style. Subscribe to preserve this wisdom. Share to spread it. And remember it when the storms come, because they always do. And the only question is whether you'll be ready with knowledge that works or assumptions that don't.